This film's about reaming out the SU carburetor bodies to fit bushes around the spindle shafts. And this is how I worked out I can do it on the mill. So the issue is that these bodies, especially these pre-war ones, where the throttle spindle goes through here, there are no bushes. It's just the body of the carburetor. And what happens is this is the throttle shaft that normally has the butterfly on it. And this fits through here. Usually what happens is the shafts wear out. I guess the brass is softer than the casting. So usually the shafts wear, but you also get a little bit of wear in the body here. And if you get too much, what happens is, it's a bit hard to see, you get wobble on the shaft. So this isn't tight in the hole. It's a bit tricky for me to show this, and I haven't got the little doohickey that lets me mount my phone onto the tripod yet, so it's all done handheld. But you can hear it rattling inside there. So what we do when you get the rebuild kit, it comes with these replacement bushes, and these are the ones that came directly from the SU people at Berlin. They're little split bushes and they're Teflon coated steel. It'll focus on it. So what we need to do is drill out the body in here and then ream it out to be able to push those bushes in. Now what you want to do is you don't drill or ream all the way through. You want to leave a little piece of metal here around the lip to keep that seal. If you ream all the way through, you end up with a sort of a step where the bush goes through, and you can get leakage around that, and that's not good. So the process for this, or the way I've figured out I can do it, is I've made this plate that the carb body bolts to firmly, and then this is in the milling vise. Now in the collet I have a piece of 1/4 inch aluminium, because that's just what I happen to have. And I have this set up so that if we lower the mill, this will pass all the way through the carburetor body. So I've sort of lined it all up so that this will go all the way through. Once we get there. Now that's just so that I know that the shaft, the spindle, is totally in line with the holes in the carb body, because of course we can only do one side at a time, and you have to keep them in alignment, otherwise the throttle shaft here would bind up inside the body. So now that I've got this through, I know this is perfectly parallel to the mill spindle. I've locked off the slides, and if we take this back up, I'm not going to be able to film this because, like I say, I haven't got it on the tripod, so I'm going to have to do it in bits and pieces. But the first thing we need to do is drill out the body, just with a drill. This is, I can't remember what it is in imperial sizes, but it's pretty close to 7.5 millimeters. We need to ream 8 millimeters for these little bushes. So I have my 8 millimeter chucking reamer here. So that's too much material to ream out all in one go, so we first drill it a little bit closer, and then we finish it off with the reamer. So what I will do is I'll swap the collets over for the drill. We'll put that in here, and then we measure the depth of the bush. So if I zero these, and we can measure this. It's a bit hard to zero it with one hand, and it's moving. There we go. We can get the length, and then I can use the readout on the mill to go down just enough depth for the bush to push in. And that will leave that little lip on the inside of the carburetor body around the butterfly valve. So the idea will be I drill and ream one side, and then I can take this out and I can push the bush in. In fact, I can actually push the bush in here using the mill. I can make a little spacer or use a washer or something, and then use this to actually press the bush home. And that way I know it's going in perfectly straight. And then I'll have to take this out of the vise, flip it over, and because we've got the bush that was on this side at the bottom now, I can do the same trick, and I can lower the spindle through the new bush, and then I know that this will be set up parallel to the new bushing, and then I can do the other side. That's the plan. We'll see how it goes. I'm pretty sure that'll work, so let's try. Okay, I've gone ahead and I've fitted the more or less 7.5mm drill bit into the collet here. I've measured the bushes, and I know I need to make about a 10mm deep hole, and that gives me plenty of meat on the inside of the throat of the carb, because these bosses are about 16mm deep. So I want the bushes to be as close to the outside as possible without sticking out, so you've got as much across the body as possible. So what we'll do is we'll lower this down until the drill just touches, and then up on here, oh, it's pretty close to 10mm already, we can, it's a bit hard, zero this out, and now I just need to go down 10mm, and that should give me the right depth hole. I can't do this one-handed, so I'm going to stop, do that, and then we'll have a look at how it came out. So now I've drilled down 10mm with my 7.5mm drill bit. It looks like this drill bit isn't the sharpest one, so it's not the cleanest hole in the world, but it should be good enough that I can now run the 8mm reamer down through it. So I'll fit this up into the collet and we'll ream the hole out. It's worth mentioning, it should be fairly obvious, but I'm not moving anything between all these drilling and reaming operations. The only thing that's moving is the spindle up and down, so that keeps everything in alignment. So I'll go ahead and ream out the hole now. So I've gone ahead and reamed the hole out. I don't know if we can, you should be able to see down there, there's a little step, which is what the bush will push in up against. And I will measure it just to make sure it is the correct length. But what we should be able to do is I can swap out the reamer. I'll probably put back in my aluminium bar, and then I will push this in. This should actually go in straight by itself. I may just take this out of the vise and carefully tap it in with a hammer. But I think it's safer to do it in the mill. The one thing to note is after swapping over to the reamer, make sure you reset your zero on the DRO, because your length here might be different to the length when you had the drill bit in there. Okay, I've gone through and reamed this out to 8mm, which is what they say you should ream it out to fit the bush. It turns out that the bush is an easy push fit into there. It's not hard to put in there at all. I may actually put a little drop of Loctite on it. I don't think it'll ever come out, but just to be sure. The other thing I need to do, which I'll do when I do the next one, is actually drilling the hole has left a little bit of a burr on that inside lip in there. So if I take this throttle shaft, it won't go through there. So what I'll do to fix that is I have a 1/4" reamer here, which is the right diameter for the throttle shaft. I'm just going to run that through that little lip there just to clean that up. When I do the next one, the other sides in the next carburetor, I will do that step on the mill as well. So I'll just clean this up and then push the bush through. Okay, I've pushed the bush in there with just a little smear of red Loctite on it, and you can see now the shaft is a nice fit in there. So what I'll do is I will unbolt the carburetor body from my little steel backing plate, flip it over, and basically do the same operation again. But of course now we've got the new bush in the bottom to line everything up on. So I'm going to go and do that now. So basically I have this set up to do exactly the same operation again. The body's been turned upside down, of course. You shouldn't have to adjust the axis this way at all. If your plate is completely perpendicular to the vise, the alignment in this direction shouldn't have changed, even though we've turned the carb body upside down. I guess it depends on how accurately these are made, but I think they're fairly accurate. They kind of have to be, especially for twin carb setups where you need these shafts to be in alignment between multiple carbs. Although I guess that's why they usually have a little spring mechanism in the middle to allow for any misalignment. But I found mine was set up exactly. I didn't have to adjust anything. The only thing I've done differently this time is instead of using my little aluminium rod, which isn't very precise, it's probably a little bit over a quarter, which is good because it lines up on the slightly oversized holes. But because I've now got a good bush in the bottom end here, I'm actually able to use the throttle spindle itself to set the alignment. So now I know with this spindle, this is now completely perpendicular to it. So I'm going to go ahead and I will drill this and then ream it, and then we'll push in the new bush. So this is the extra step I should have done in the first place. I've drilled the hole and I've reamed it out to 8mm. Now I'm just going to run through the 1/4 inch reamer just to remove any burr that's on the edge of the inside of that hole there, that little lip. This will just make sure the shaft will actually go straight through. We don't run it all the way down, we just run it through this top bush, because obviously we wouldn't want to hit the Teflon lined bush on the other side with the reamer, because that would ruin it. So this now has both bushes pushed into it. Before you try putting the shaft through, it's best to unbolt it from the plate and clean out the inside of the carb, because of course there's all that swarf in there, so we don't want to get that into those bushes. So I'll give this a good clean out and then we'll see how the shaft fits. So now I have the shaft inside the body of the carb through those bushes. It was a little bit tight to start off with, so I actually just gave the shaft a bit of a polish with some Brasso, and that made it a really nice tight sliding fit. Now, just to make sure it is all working correctly, I'm just going to temporarily screw the throttle disc in place. And these discs are actually handed, or they can go up in multiple directions, because if you look at them edge on, the edges aren't square. There's that sort of angle on them. And that's so that when in the closed position, they push tight up against the inside of the throat of the carb. So you have to make sure you get that the right way around. And it helps to put this is the linkage that will eventually move the shaft. You want to put that in place so that you're absolutely certain which way around the shaft rotates to open and close the carburetor. So I know it happens to open that way, rotates clockwise. So I've got the throttle disc in there. I'm just going to put in the screws temporarily. These are the little screws they use, and they're special screws with that little split on the end. And what you do is you screw those in, and then you just open that out just a little bit so that the screw, there's no possibility of it coming undone and being ingested by the engine. One thing I find handy is these, I don't know what they're called. It's a special screwdriver. I think they use it a lot they used to use it in the old telephone days and telephone exchanges. And it's got these sort of movable tips, which you operate by sliding this collar. What this lets you do is you put this on the end of the screw, and then you can slide the collar, and it expands the tip, and it sort of locks the screw in place. It'll hold the screw for you. So with the screw held on the end there, it makes it really easy to get in there and do those screws up. So I'll screw that up temporarily and we'll see what it looks like. This shows how the screw is gripped by this special screwdriver. I actually bought this to help making the Enigma machine easier to assemble, but I haven't had to use it so far. The other thing that's handy is a scriber, just to poke into the screw holes there, just to make sure that's all lined up. But now I should be able to screw that in. You don't use these special screwdrivers for doing the screws up tight, because it'll ruin the tips. It's just for holding them and getting them in place. But because I'm not doing them up tight for this anyway, that should be fine. I'll put the other one in, which I can't do with one hand, and we'll see how the shaft looks. Actually, one trick I learnt online, while these screws aren't done up really tight, you kind of leave them loose, but just so the shaft, the disc can move, you do them up like that, and you just sort of slam this shut a couple of times to make sure it's actually centralized in the carb throat there. And then I've got a different screwdriver just to nip those up. So that may still need a little bit of polishing. It feels a little bit tight, but there's no motion in the shaft at all. So rebushing it has made a big difference. What I need to do next, which I'm actually a bit worried about, is you have to set this up. This actuator is pinned to the shaft here. So I need to, effectively you have to hand drill these. Apparently they were hand drilled at the factory, which, looking at the ones I've got, would explain why none of them seem to be very consistent where the pin goes through. The rebuild kit does come with a replacement pin somewhere. It'll be in there. So what I'll need to do is set this up. The kit comes with measurements on how much clearance you need around everything. That's this here. So I'll set that up and drill it and pin it. I may not do that yet, because once you've done that, that's done, that's fixed. And if you mess it up, you'd have to buy another shaft. So I'll probably go ahead and rebush the other carburetor, and then I'll worry about assembling them all. Oh, since I've got all these bits out, another one of the things I read in a book, it was actually in an older book. I think it was a period manual for SU carbs. They talked about how you can measure when you've got paired carbs if the pistons are similar, because you effectively want a matched set of carbs so that they move in unison. And one of the things that's really important with these is the fit of this body inside the suction chamber. And apparently the way you test that is, oh, I'm not sure I can do this with one hand. You can block off the little hole here, and then you lift this up and you let it drop. And it takes a certain number of seconds to drop off there. I think for these ones it was 3 to 5 seconds. So basically hold it up and let it slowly drop down. And basically you want to do that for both of your carbs and make sure they're similar. These two are reasonably close, I think. Before you do this, make sure everything is spotlessly clean. That probably goes for anything you're doing with carburetors. You just want to keep everything absolutely clean. I go through cans and cans of carburetor cleaner because that's what it's built for. But these are pretty good. They seem more or less in sync. And then once I have done the other carb body, pin these on, it's just a matter of rebuilding the things. Which I can't do today because I forgot about the little instruction that says you have to soak all the cork seals for 24 hours. So I'll probably get that far, leave those soaking, and then that can be a job for during the week. but that's pretty much how I do it. I'm not exactly hugely experienced at these. I think this is only about the third and fourth carburetors I've rebuilt, but if you're methodical with it and you have the right sort of tools and things, it's not too bad. One final thing I should mention that the old SU carburetor book I found explained was there is another sort of wear you can get in these carburetors, and I'm not sure we'll be able to see it, but you can end up with wear around where the edge of the throttle disc touches the throat of the carburetor. You can sort of see there's a little groove in there. Now, they do mention that this doesn't actually matter too much, and I believe the reason for that is these discs, there's always a little bit of a gap around them anyway. They're not 100% perfect. And the other reason is when you set up the little linkage here, you've got this idle adjustment screw. That's what this is. And when this is on here and pinned to the shaft, when you set up the carburetor, you adjust that screw to set your idle speed. And what that's doing is opening the butterfly just slightly, because the engine, of course, always needs some air to run. Now, that little bit of wear in there isn't really going to make any difference. And I believe the reason is because it's a fixed amount. It doesn't change. And it'll be taken into account when you adjust your idle screw. So that wear doesn't matter as much as the wear in the throttle shaft. So if your throttle shaft is wobbling around, the problem is you can get air leaking in through these shafts, and it's very inconsistent because the shaft is moving around and the engine is vibrating and the car's moving around. It means you can have an awful lot of trouble setting the correct idle speed because this is variable, it's moving. That wear with that groove around there won't make any difference. At least that was my understanding of it. I suppose I won't know until I've actually got these carbs on an engine and I try to get them running. I suspect that's going to be quite some time in the future, but we'll see. I'm going to go ahead and rebush the second carb now, and then I'll soak these in oil and I'll assemble them probably later in the week. Somebody did ask if I could do a little video showing the process of the plating, so I may do that just for plating these little screws. These are steel screws and they should be able to be plated up quite nicely. Should be okay to plate the springs as well, I think, although the solution is a bit acidy and I'm always a bit wary about putting springs and things in acid. So I'll probably just clean up and oil the springs, but the little steel screws, they could be zinc plated, so I may do another film showing that. I have a further addition. I've mounted the second carb body onto the mill now, and this one, the bushes aren't as worn as the first one, so I can actually use the replacement shaft as my alignment tool. And I've got that all set up so that drops all the way through nicely without catching on anything. Everything's tight, of course, make sure the vise is tight. And I did find I had to adjust the y-axis here, which is the axis going this way. And I had to move it almost 0.5 millimeter. Now what that means is when these carbs, if you bolted the two carb bodies onto a flat plane, such as an intake manifold, these shafts are 0.5 millimeter misaligned. Now, I can adjust that. You could skim off the flanges on the carbs. You could maybe play with the thickness of the gaskets. But I believe this is why when you've got twin carbs like this, you have that little flexible mounting in between the two shafts. And what that's for is to transfer the rotational movement of the shaft between one carb and the other, but account for any misalignment, either forwards and backwards or up and down. So I'm not sure I've actually got one of those. I've got an SU carburetor graveyard there of various bits and pieces. I may end up having to buy those new from the Berlin people. But that's one of the reasons why you need that little flexible coupling in the middle. I'm going to go ahead and finish this off now. So this is the final part of the process before you assemble the carburetor, and that's attaching this little throttle shaft, throttle lever to the shaft. And on these early carbs, it's actually pinned in place. So this is the part that worried me the most, was pinning this and getting it accurate. The instructions tell you to have a 1/8 gap under here, 1/8 clearance, with the throttle disc closed, and 0.38 of a millimeter clearance between the shaft and the lever. To get this clearance, I made up some shim washers, just out of cardboard actually, and just put that in there just to give me that gap. And instead of setting the gap here, I did something that I saw online that seems to make more sense to me, which is you set the throttle disc so it's completely open, completely vertical, and then put the lever up against its stop like that, and then drill the hole. So you know when the throttle is hard up against the stop, there's the minimum obstruction through the throat of the carburetor. Because if you get this measurement wrong, what can happen is the throttle disc will open, and then it could actually go past 90 degrees. So you end up restricting it a little bit at wide open throttle. So you want wide open throttle to be as unrestricted as possible. Now, the way I drilled this, and I think I mentioned before, apparently these were drilled by hand at the factory, is I set it up on the mill, and I just used these 1, 2, 3 blocks. And this is all a bit crude, but it worked. I basically balanced it. I set the heights of these. These are set to the same height, so I can balance across it like that. And it was just a matter of holding that where I wanted it, making sure it was more or less vertical, and then just carefully drilling through. I went through really slowly. I was worried about the drill grabbing at the end and pulling it out of my hands, or rather pulling my hands into the chuck, but as long as you go really slowly, it's okay. And that worked fine. I managed to get the pin through. I didn't end up making an extra hole in the bottom of it, which we can see there. And I just hammered through the little pin, and I did put some Loctite on it just to make sure, but that works really well now. I did have a little bit of an accident with the other carb. Despite all my measuring everything carefully and doing things as carefully as possible, one of the holes has ended up slightly off center, and I ended up scratching one of the little Teflon bushes. So the way I'm going to get around that is, I still have the other bush, that one's fine. I'm going to order a new bush, which I'll have to get from Berlin, but I need to order needles for these carbs anyway. And I drilled the other side out slightly bigger. And what I will do is, that gives me a little bit of wiggle room on that bush. And I will just fit that with some of the Loctite bearing fit. And I think that should work fine. The little bush won't be pushed in ultra tight in there. I'm guessing it's a split bush and they need to close up a little bit. But I think that'll work, and the throttle shaft should still work correctly. The other thing to note is I need to check, but when you're setting these up as a pair of carbs, you want the throttle lever on the other one to be on the other side. So you've just got plain shaft in the middle here that you can join with one of those little spacers I was talking about, the little joiners, that lets you align two shafts. So I won't cut this down until I have these on the car, basically, and I can set that little centerpiece, which is another thing I'll need to order anyway. You can see these are unmatched carbs. These would have just come off random cars. So you can see the little indent where this one would have had the idle screw on the same side as this one. I think, though, I want to put it on this side. Exactly how the linkages will work then, I'm not entirely certain. I need to look into that. But that's one of the things with these sort of special cars is you basically make it work. You figure out what you need and you build it. So I think we should be good with these finally.